Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Jodie Glean, and I am a member of the Greater Toronto Area Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, and also the chair of our Social Action Committee. For this YouTube series, we are engaging a very important topic around knowing your rights, and we will be exploring a number of different circumstances and challenges that many Black and racialized community members engage in different sectors and areas. For this week, and in this particular episode, we will be engaging the topic of navigating the workplace when experiencing racial harassment or discrimination. And so to hold this space with us, we have the fabulous Lavinia Latham. I won't be going too much into Lavinia's bio because I will be asking Lavinia to introduce themselves. But Lavinia joins us as a professional, as a criminal defense lawyer and an estates litigation lawyer before settling into her stream around human rights law. And today, Lavinia works for the Toronto Catholic District School Board as their human rights and equity advisor. I want to be clear that the sharing and the conversation is not legal advice by any means, and you are meant to engage your appropriate legal supports if you are indeed navigating such a challenging time. But the purpose of this series is just to allow for us to learn from key lessons, key tips along our administrators and professionals' journeys along their way. And so today we're here to learn from Lavinia's experience and expertise. So Lavinia, thank you so much for joining us for this episode. And I'm just going to kickstart if you're ready.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Awesome. So I want to kickstart with just a round of introductions. Can you share more about yourself and your entry point in this discussion on navigating racial discrimination, harassment, and the complaints resolution processes in the workplace?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're 100% right that I did practice criminal defense law for a bit. But my entry point into human rights law was actually once I started working for the African Canadian Legal Clinic. And in that role, I was the litigation lawyer. So having to, develop legal arguments for presentation when we're acting as an intervener on various different files. Specifically, I drafted factsum on 4 different occasions that found themselves at the Supreme Court of Canada for oral argument with external counsel to the legal agency itself. So the work has always been near and dear to my heart. Once I started working with African Canadian Legal Clinic on those particular matters that really truly impact the Black community here in Canada and across the country, I really realized that that was what I was meant to do. The role, not only did it involve legal argument, written argument, oral argument, but it also involved working with other lawyers within the organization on policy analysis, on stakeholder relations, on, even going to various different ministries and having the conversations that we need to have around what does your policies and your processes look like once they're applied to the Black community and how can we improve those. So it's been a really fantastic ride, really dealing with human rights from a responsive, reactive perspective in the sense of something has happened, litigation ensues, to where we are now with the role that I'm in at Toronto Catholic as a human rights and equity advisor, taking that knowledge from, having argued at the Human Rights Tribunal, having presented argument for Supreme Court of Canada, now taking all that knowledge, understanding what a decision maker might decide in those circumstances and applying it on the back end so that we don't have to go through the litigation process, which is oftentimes very timely and very expensive.
Okay. So once again, you can see why Lavinia is present with us today. Really excited to learn more about some of the lessons learned and strategies you would invite people to employ when navigating some very difficult moments. Okay, so give us some context and perspective. What has been your personal experience, whether as an employee who may have experienced racial discrimination, or as a lawyer or legal advisor providing support to someone who has come forward with a complaint? So in other words, given your experiences, how does racial discrimination, harassment show up in the workplace?
Yeah, interestingly, it was when I was in the most vulnerable state as an employee, which is as an articling student. Articling students are, for those who don't understand the term, it's essentially the internship that a young lawyer will do before they're actually licensed to practice law. So they work underneath other licensed lawyers, and they do this for 10 months. And then following the 10 months, and an extremely long bar exam, then they become licensed to practice law in Ontario. So that being said, in that role, there were a lot of things that happened, because I'm not necessarily a full-blown lawyer. You're totally vulnerable. All the stakes are against you because you're trying to enter this profession. So you've got to essentially prove yourself to every single person you come into contact with, which is a lot to ask of a young, 20-something-year-old female, young Black female at that, entering into a predominantly older and white male profession. So at the time, I didn't have the human rights hat on as snugly as I have it on now. And so there were a lot of transgressions that happened that I may have raised it, but I didn't follow through with it in the way that I should have, knowing what I know now. So, fast forward a couple of years, bar exam has been passed. I'm now a lawyer, dealt with what I needed to deal with to get through my articles, and I'm practicing human rights law. And cases are coming to me now where individuals are in a very similar vulnerable position. Perhaps the job that is subjecting them to discrimination is the only job they have to pay their rent, not mortgage rent. They're just trying to keep things together, keep things alive, and they're coming in. They're feeling really backed up, really in a very awful place. And so, what I've seen the most is individuals who just don't know what to do. They feel if they speak up, they're going to be subjected to reprisal, which is essentially like a negative consequence as a result of coming forward. Or they might feel like, maybe they can say something, but they better have something in their back pocket to go to, because even if there is no reprisal, raising those types of issues in such a toxic environment will inevitably create an even more toxic environment, maybe not by the employer themselves, but by their other coworkers and the environment, that type of a thing. So to answer the question, we always start off by, helping the individual navigate their circumstances the best they can at a lower local level. So if you can resolve at that level, that's great, because the higher up things go is the higher the chances are of the things I mentioned in the past, which is like reprisal, the toxic environment, all of those things. So if you can get past that hump, great. The interesting thing, though, is that the way human rights are set up here in Canada, we do actually, the tribunal actually does expect that individuals will navigate and exhaust those lower processes first before going to the tribunal. So like I said before, kind of connecting it to the initial piece that I mentioned about articling, those situations that occurred were never resolved, absolutely not in a, respectable way that would satisfy the Human Rights Tribunal. It absolutely should have been, pushed forward and advanced. But knowing what I know now, I encourage people to take advantage of those internal processes, understand that confidentiality truly means confidentiality when you are contacting people in roles like a human rights officer, human rights equity advisor, any of those kinds of things, before you decide to go ahead and take legal action. And I wanted to reiterate something you mentioned earlier. This is not legal advice at all. This is legal information. If you do have specific circumstances that are concerning to you, I would absolutely recommend that you contact a lawyer ASAP. You can contact Legal Aid Ontario for free legal advice. If you're Black, you can contact the Black Legal Action Center, but nothing in this particular phone call should be taken as actual legal advice.
Okay, thank you. And your response is actually a great segue. And I'm actually going to ask you to build upon some of the pieces you spoke to, because I want to really create the scenario that we have a worker, an employee, and now we're talking broad, like workplaces can be so many. It could be a small business where there may not be the appropriate processes in place. It could be larger institutions that have, to your point, the appropriate sort of offices and personnel that has responsibility of addressing these concerns. So I keep that in the context and background as I ask this question. So I come to you, or I'm coming forward and I'm saying, I'm experiencing something in this workplace. Where do I begin? What would you identify as key steps that I should take even prior to seeking legal advice or going to the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal? And you made mention of the local level, so maybe even exploring that a little bit further. What does it mean for me to have experienced something or may have experienced something over time and now being ready to make the decision to say, I'm coming forward? What kind of guidance would you provide a colleague in that situation?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So it really depends on the particular circumstances, but I'm going to assume that there's no support person in the organization. I'm going to assume the worst of the worst. Like you are feeling this, you're by yourself, there's really no one there to help. I would reach out to someone who can be a support person just in case, like to speak to outside of the organization. So you have someone to kind of navigate those negative emotions with. But internal to the organization, I would recommend connecting with your manager. If the manager is the one who's subjecting you to the discrimination, then whoever their manager is, giving them an opportunity to kind of step in. But even before that stage, whoever it is that you're experiencing discrimination from, giving them an opportunity to kind of speak about where they are in that continuum, if you feel comfortable doing so. If you don't, then the next step would always be whoever that person's management is, because it's actually their responsibility under various pieces of legislation, not just the code, but also OSHA, which is the Ontario Health and Safeties Act, to make sure the individuals are working in an environment that's not toxic, that's conducive to productivity, that's not harmful to their health, safety, and well-being. So that's why I would recommend connecting with the manager if you can do so.
Awesome. Thank you. I have so many sort of follow-up part B's to that question, but one, I want to reinforce a very important messaging that you just brought forward, because when we talk about addressing racial discrimination, harassment, many times we provide that response from a step-by-step process, and sometimes we don't really take the time to address the trauma of it and the emotional impact that these experiences have. So to your point, finding your community. And many times your community is external to the workplace or external to your employer. So having that, whether it be family, it could be a spiritual place, it could be your network, having somewhere to unpack. It could be a counselor, it could be a therapist. Having somewhere to unpack is so greatly needed. And so if you have access to the appropriate sort of employee resources, employee assistant programs within your workplace, please do activate them. So thank you for alluding to that there, Lavinia. But I have a part B for you. Many a times, manager and direct supervisor are friends.
Yeah.
Many times they have a close relationship. You know, it could be something as grand as they go golfing together, not to be stereotypical, but it's the truth.
It's true.
Or they at minimum are extremely collegial. So if you're in a situation where you feel like I can't even trust my boss's boss because they're friends, then do you have any guidance there as to, you know, what steps should I take, or what should I consider if I feel like I have nowhere to go? There's always somewhere to go. So do you have any guidance there?
Yeah, that's a very tricky situation. And you're right, like it happens more times than it doesn't, particularly in these roles where people are required to work nonstop. Like no matter what you do, you will develop a relationship with your colleagues, and be extremely collegial at work at best, right? And the golfing at worst. But in those circumstances, absolutely exhaust the processes, but don't just exhaust them, but keep a paper record, right? Because at the end of the day, if you do hit litigation, if you do hit the need to contact Black Legal Action Center or Legal Aid, whatever it might be, or Human Rights Legal Support Center is another fantastic one for those of you who don't fall within the catchment area for Black or for legal aid. In that circumstance, then I would recommend making sure that you have all your communications. So communicate via email. That's a very easy way to keep a record, right? Also, if there's, you can audiovisual, there's rules and laws around that. So, I mean, you don't want to record people per se without their permission, but having as much evidence in your back pocket as possible is good. And then connecting with human resources. So human resources should be available in every single organization, be it a large one or a small one. If it is a small organization, then contacting even the ombudsman. The Ombudsman of Ontario, it has the ability to kind of go in and provide supports for people depending on whatever their issues might be, and then kind of exhaust those processes. So if you do have a human rights, a lot of these positions, they recognize, thanks to the whole George Floyd era south of the border, they recognize the need for DEI. They recognize the need. DEI is diversity, equity, and inclusion. They recognize that need for someone who has that lens, and human rights. And so all of these various different organizations, particularly the bigger ones, will have someone who you can talk to, who you can engage with in a confidential and private matter, to kind of find solutions. But that initial piece, giving people the opportunity to, correct, change course with their behavior, that's very important because those pieces are going to help to make the argument that, hey, something real is happening to me. I tried to resolve it on my own. It's not working. And even more instances have happened to me. And, that just makes a stronger argument once you get to the tribunal level, because one thing that applicants don't know when they're alleging discrimination is that you launch your application, but you have the onus to prove that discrimination actually occurred on the outset. And once you can convince through your application that discrimination has occurred, then it's on the respondent to prove that it hasn't actually occurred. So right off the bat, you're starting from a place of I have to prove myself. And if you have all those nuggets in your back pocket, like I mentioned earlier, it makes that argument that much easier.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for laying out some of those key tips along the way. So to exhaust the local levels, even though you're in a small organization, accessing legal aid and accessing legal advice is always available to you along this journey, right? So I thank you for positioning that, and even mentioning the ombudsman person. I didn't even think about that. So thank you so much for that. Okay, and now that response again sort of triggers or goes into our next question. As you made mention around over the past 2 to 3 years, the explosion within the diversity, equity, and inclusion world, and employers and organizations realizing we need to do better at this. But even more so, what came out of that were the experiences that people were sharing. And there's not one sector that was immune to where Black individuals, racialized individuals are sharing the experiences of racism. And the one I want to hold a question on is around the experiences of racial microaggressions in the workplace. Now, to your point, you talked about how when a complaint is brought forward to the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal, the onus is on the person coming forward with the complaint to prove, right? But yet we know how difficult it can be, particularly when the actions or behaviors are more subtle. So I just wanted to position this and place this on the table around when thinking about experiences of racial microaggressions, or what folks define as racial microaggressions. How difficult is it to prove that one is experiencing racial discrimination, harassment in the workplace? What has been your experiences with this?
Oh, it's incredibly difficult to prove. It's so difficult. And that's why details are king. So microaggressions, people really don't like if you just say like, she said it with a tone, or there was a look, or, I just felt uncomfortable. Like while you and I will totally understand it as, females identifying as Black, particularly identifying as Black, you know, others might not necessarily understand it. So those outside of the community will be like, okay, so what, you got to look, or so what, you feel that there was a vibe. Like, that's why details are king, because once you kind of couch that experience in the details surrounding it, like, this is how I was differentially impacted. This is how I was differentially treated. She had a smirk to her voice when referencing me that was not there when referencing others. And this interaction took place around me talking about Black rights. Now I've illuminated what it looks like and why it's a microaggression, and why it, along with everything else happening, it actually lends itself closer to anti-Black racism as opposed to something that's less, innocuous. So, I mean, that being said, like, details, when people draft their applications for the Human Rights Tribunal, it's a people's court, and everyone's encouraged to actually draft their own applications, represent yourself, everything will be cool. No, it's not. Lawyers are in there, everyone is legally trained. And so factums need to be drafted in a certain way to get it approved. And you don't want to be in a situation where it's getting kicked back to you and someone saying, like, at the Human Rights Tribunal level at that what you're experiencing is not discrimination, because that could be incredibly, further traumatizing, victimizing. Like, I know what I experienced, I'm putting it in writing, which is a lot for some people, and you're telling me no, right? So in those instances, the Human Rights Legal Support Center is amazing for helping people with that first piece. But in addition to taking this little piece of nugget for yourself, all the details possible. Like, nothing is ever too much. If the document is 20 pages, so be it. Like, at least there's those details in there.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that, and emphasizing I find because, I work in a very similar space, and I find that many folks lead with how they felt. Now, impact is extremely important, and explaining why impact or what the impact was is extremely important. But many times, folks may indicate it felt as though, or I feel like they were saying, and they express how they were feeling devoid of action, and devoid of the action or the actual behavior that led to that feeling or impact. So, to your point, emphasizing the treatment, the details, the what actually happened is extremely important. So the emphasis on documentation, I cannot echo Lavinia's terms enough, is extremely important when navigating these processes. And to that end, wanting to invite the question, just to even broaden that out a little bit more, around from your journey, what would you identify as some of the common mistakes or the pitfalls that employees make when trying to activate their complaints resolution processes? Are there some common things that you find people engage in that have made, even though their experiences are real, may not have allowed for their complaints process? I would argue even prior to the tribunal level, that would have made their complaints process be a bit more successful in resolution at the local level within the employer. And on the same side, are there common mistakes or pitfalls that employers make? So I also wanted to talk to the employers, managers, people managers, who have the responsibility to address these concerns. What type of mistakes or pitfalls are you seeing sort of on both sides of the coin? Just wanted to share in that discussion.
Yeah, that's an amazing question, Jodie. Thank you so much for that one. I mean, with complainants, so I think the major issue with it is like not being concise. So I know I just finished mentioning how important the details are, and they are, right? But being concise and being clear. So, not everybody writing levels, it varies. Some have strong writing levels, others don't. If you know you don't have strong writing skills, then have someone who does have strong writing skills review whatever it is that you're submitting. Emails are king, but not 20 million emails, right? And that's easy to do when you're upset, right? Like you're upset, you need to document things, so you just kind of fire away at the keyboard. That I wouldn't recommend that because people tune out the same way they tune out when they're listening. Unfortunately, they tune out with writing emails as well. But like between, kind of going off verbally versus going off in writing, I would absolutely recommend like write what you need to write. Like it's not a detrimental approach. It's just not the best approach if you can kind of get to where you're getting to in a concise manner. The other common pitfall I see is individuals kind of rejecting the internal human rights processes. So they're so upset, they don't really care about the internal, they really just want to get to the top of things, contact ministers, trustees, everybody, politicians, like whoever they can, right? And that's not a good approach either, because what it does is it kind of makes it seem as though the issue is you, right? So there may be very real circumstances. Your complaint is 100% authentic and real. But if you're emailing everybody and you're getting upset with everybody, then now it starts to paint the picture that you're just a problematic individual, and that's not helpful for the complaint either. So I know that that's very difficult, especially, this area of human rights law, it's arguably one of the only areas that deals so much with feelings, right? But that's real, and there are processes and ways to navigate that. So I guess the best nugget out of all of that is to try to control how it is that you're responding, and know that that controlled approach is going to lead to the result that you ultimately want, which is to have someone hear the complaint and then find a solution to that complaint. For employers, managers, individuals who run a team, the biggest issue that I see there is not taking complaints seriously. So if somebody communicates verbally that something is happening, they don't take it seriously in the sense of, documenting that or following up on it or presenting some type of a solution. I find that there's a lot of hesitancy to conduct investigations, which is also something that managers should be doing. Principals, I work in education, so principals should be conducting their internal investigations. People should not be landing on a right or wrong conclusion without navigating to the best of their ability an unbiased investigation process. The other piece is individuals on both ends actually being unwilling to negotiate, unwilling to engage in the mediation process. That process is fantastic. I mean, if you can engage in a mediation process at your local level within the organization, that then becomes another nugget piece that you could include in your application if it does get to the tribunal level. And that looks really good. That makes a decision maker a lot more sympathetic to the applicant and their complaint than it does if that wasn't there. Because again, it shows that whole, I tried to resolve this on my own. I'm not just leaning on the tribunal. This is a real issue that deserves the litigation process. Managers, another thing that there's an issue with is kind of, covering for each other. So kind of going back to the whole, we're collegial and we're friends, and they would never do something like that. No, that's very inappropriate. Again, putting back on that unbiased hat and really navigating forward towards a solution, focusing on the issue and not the people, I find is a lot easier to kind of stay level-headed and stay in the realm of human rights and resolving whatever discrimination has hit the table. So those are some quick pieces that I can think of off the top of my head because I see them so often.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you, Lavinia, so much for your time. I'm actually going to end with this next question. Wanting to acknowledge that there are many Black and racialized folks who are the employers, who are the business owners. They may have small teams, or they may at minimum be the people managers. So building upon your response to the last question, what guidance would you provide to ensure that they are creating workplace conditions that are free from discrimination and harassment for their teams? So being a bit more proactive, how do we equip Black and racialized community leaders to ensure that they themselves are not engaging in problematic behaviors and are fostering the inclusive environments? Any thoughts there?
Yeah, that's really interesting because I've seen it happen a couple times, whereby, like you just mentioned, the discrimination is flowing from a racialized individual or leader down to someone else who might be racialized or maybe a part of another community experiencing marginalization. In those instances, I would recommend that people do the work. So, you need to be trained. Like I myself, I'm a human rights lawyer. Tomorrow I have training on 2S LGBTQ rights because not because I'm a human rights lawyer means that I know everything. No, we all need to be engaging in learning processes. Communities and stakeholders change, how they feel about terminology, how they feel about various different practices that might have been okay 10 years ago or even 5 years ago, but aren't okay today. So it really is a practice. And I think leaders, I know we're asking a lot because, leaders of organizations, they still have their day job, but then we're asking for this additional layer to be in alignment with the code. But it's crucial. I mean, it's the law and it's necessary. So engage in that continual practice of learning. Listen. That's the biggest piece. Like, you'd be surprised how many of these human rights complaints can just be resolved by listening. Maybe an apology is made and a promise, or at least a bona fide undertaking to do better in the future. So many of them could be kicked out of the park like that because again, we're dealing with feelings, right? And oftentimes we see with like leaders who are Black or a part of another marginalized group, they feel like they're above that they couldn't possibly be the individual who's doing the wrongdoing. But we know that anti-Black racism can flow from Black people to Black people. Like, that happens all the time. And so we all have to be on alert to kind of undo some of the socialization that we've all been exposed to by virtue of being in a Eurocentric society.
Yes. Ooh, Lavinia, I need you for another hour because let me tell you, yeah, oh, ooh, you touched
You're the
on so
best.
many things. You
Your
touched on
questions.
so many things for that last question, but thank you. When you said listen, that struck my heart. Yeah, oh, thank you for putting in those components there. Really encouraging that we all have a responsibility to foster spaces of inclusivity and belonging. And to your point, recognizing that we all encompass multiple identities and we're bringing our fulsome selves into the workplace means that as leadership, we have work to do and responsibility to learn more. We don't know all things, right? So, Lavinia, to your point, I just want to say thank you for sharing those thoughts. Thank you for taking us on this journey. It's just a small contribution that we are working towards making, just to help folks think through things differently as they're engaging these difficult times. And we hope that many of you are not navigating these types of processes. But if you are, we're hopeful that this has contributed to your pathway along the way. So Lavinia, my friend, my sis, thank you so much for
Thank
your
you.
time. And thank you to all of you for joining us for this episode. Thanks so much.